Chapter 5, Alpha and Omega. Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. What does this mean? It means the entire series of causation, from the first originating movement to the final and completed result. We may take this on any scale from the creation of a cosmos to the creation of a lady's robe. Everything has its origin in an idea, a thought, and it has its completion in the manifestation of that thought in form. Many intermediate stages are necessary, but the alpha and omega of the series are the thought and the thing. This shows us that in essence the thing already existed in the thought. Omega is already potential in alpha. Just as in the Pythagorean system all numbers are said to proceed from unity and to be resolved back again into them. Now it is this general principle of the already existence of the thing in the thought that we have to lay hold of. And as we find it true in an architect's design of a house that is to be, so we find it true in the great work of the architect of the universe. When we see this, we have realized a general principle which we find at work everywhere. That is the meaning of a general principle. It can be applied to any sort of subject, and the use of studying general principles is to give them particular application to anything we may have to deal with. Now what we have to deal with most of all is ourselves, and so we come to the consideration of alpha and omega in the human being. In the vision of St. John, the speaker of the words, "I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last," is described as like unto a son of man. That is, however transcendent the appearance in the vision, it is essentially human, and thus suggests to us the presence of the universal principle at the human level. But the figure in the apocalyptic vision is not that of a man as we ordinarily know him. It is that of Omega as it subsists enshrined in Alpha. It is the ideal of humanity as it subsists in the divine mind, which was manifested in objective form to the eyes of the seer, and therefore presented the Alpha and Omega of that idea in all the majesty of divine glory. But if we grasp the truth that the thing is already existent in the thought, do we not see that this transcendent Omega must be already existent in the divine ideal of every one of us? If on the plane of the absolute time is not, then does it not follow that this glorified humanity is a present fact in the divine mind? And if this is so, then this fact is eternally true regarding every human being. But if it is true that the thing exists in the thought, it is equally true that the thought finds form in the thing. And since things exist under the relative condition of time and space, they are necessarily subject to the law of growth. So that while the subsistence of the thing in the thought is perfect ab initio, the expression of the thought in the thing is a matter of gradual development. This is a point which we must never lose sight of in our studies, and we must never lose sight of the perfection of the thing in the thought, because we do not yet see the perfection of the thought in the thing. Therefore, we must remember that man, as we know him now, has by no means reached the ultimate of his evolution. We are only yet in the making, but we have now reached a point where we can facilitate the evolutionary process by conscious cooperation with the creative spirit. Our share in this work commences with the recognition of the divine ideal of man, and thus finding the pattern by which we are to be guided. For since the person to be created after this pattern is ourself, it follows that, by whatever processes the divine ideal transforms itself into concrete reality, the place where those processes are to work must be within ourselves. In other words, the creative action of the Spirit takes place through the laws of our own mentality. If it is a true maxim that the thing must take form in the thought before the thought can take form in the thing, then it is plain that the divine ideal can only be externalized in our objective life in proportion as it is first formed in our thought. And it takes form in our thought only to the extent to which we apprehend its existence in the divine mind. By the nature of the relation between the individual mind and the universal mind, it is strictly a case of reflection. And in proportion as the mirror of our own mind blurs or clearly reflects the image of the divine ideal, so will it give rise to the correspondingly feeble or vigorous reproduction of it in our own external world. This being the rationale of the matter, why should we limit our conception of the divine ideal of ourselves? Why should we say, I am too mean a creature ever to reflect so glorious an image? Or, God never intended such a limitless ideal to be reproduced in human beings. In saying such things, we expose our ignorance of the whole law of the creative process. We shut our eyes to the fact that the omega of completion already exists in the alpha of conception, and that the alpha of conception should be nothing but a line illusion if it was not capable of expression in the omega of completion. The creative process in us is that we become the individual reflection of what we realize God to be relative to ourselves. And therefore, if we realize the divine spirit as the infinite potential of all that can constitute a perfected human being, this conception must, by the law of creative process, gradually build up a corresponding image in our mind, which in turn will act upon our external conditions. This, by the laws of mind, is the nature of the process, and it shows us what St. Paul means when he speaks of Christ being formed in us, and what in another place he calls being renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created us. It is a thoroughly logical sequence of cause and effect, and what we require is to see more clearly the law of this sequence and use it intelligently. That is why St. Paul says it is being renewed in knowledge. It is a new knowledge, the recognition of principles which we had not previously apprehended. Now the fact which in our past experience we have not grasped is that the human mind forms a new point of departure for the work of the creative spirit. And in proportion as we see this more and more clearly, the more we shall find ourselves entering into a new order of life in which we become less and less subject to the old limitations. This is not a reward arbitrarily bestowed upon us for holding dogmatically to certain mere verbal statements, but it is the natural result of understanding the supreme law of our own being. On its own plane, it is as purely scientific as the law of chemical reaction. Only here we are not dealing with the interaction of secondary causes, but with the self-originating action of spirit. Hence, a new force has to be taken into account, which does not occur in physical science, the power of feeling. Thought creates form, but it is feeling that gives vitality to thought. Thought without feeling may be constructive as in some great engineering work, but it can never be creative as in the work of an artist or musician. And that which originates within itself a new order of causation is, so far as all pre-existing forms are concerned, a creation ex nihilo, and is therefore thought expressive of feeling. It is this indissoluble union of thought and feeling that distinguishes creative thought from merely analytical thought and places it in a different category. And therefore, if we are to afford a new starting point for carrying on the work of creation, it must be by assimilating the feeling of the originating spirit as part and parcel of its thought. It is that entering into the mind of the spirit of which I spoke in the first address. Now the images in the mind of the spirit must necessarily be generic. The reason for this is that by its very nature the principle of life must be prolific, that is, tending to multiplicity, and therefore the original thought image must be fundamental to whole races and not exclusive to particular individuals. Consequently, the images in the mind of the spirit must be absolute types of the true essentials of the perfect development of the race, just what Plato meant by archetypal ideas. This is the perfect subsistence of the thing in the thought. Therefore it is that our evolution as centers of creative activity, the exponents of new laws, and through them of new conditions, depends on our realizing in the divine mind the archetype of mental perfection, at once as thought and feeling. But when we find all this in the divine mind, do we not meet with an infinite and glorious personality? There is nothing lacking of all that we can understand by personality, excepting outward form. And since the very essence of telepathy is that it dispenses with the physical presence, we find ourselves in a position of interior communion with a personality at once divine and human. This is that personality of the Spirit which St. John saw in the apocalyptic vision, and which by the very conditions of the case is the Alpha and Omega of humanity. But as I have said, it is simply generic in itself, and it becomes active and specific only by a purely personal relation to the individual. But once more, we must realize that nothing can take place except according to law, and therefore this specific relation is nothing arbitrary, but arises out of the generic law applied under specific conditions. And since what makes a law generic is precisely the fact that it does not supply the specific conditions, it follows that the conditions for the specializing of the law must be provided by the individual. Then it is that his recognition of the originating creative movement, as arising from combined thought and feeling, becomes a practical working asset. He realizes that there is a heart and mind of the Spirit reciprocal to his own heart and mind, that he is not dealing with a filmy abstraction, nor yet with a mere mathematical sequence, but with something that is pulsating with a life as warm and vivid and full of interest as his own, nay, more so. For it is the infinite of all that he himself is. And his recognition goes even further than this. For since his specialization can only take place through the individual himself, it logically follows that the life, which he thus specializes, becomes his own life. Then the individual it does not know itself apart from him. But this self-recognition through the individual cannot in any way change the inherent nature of the creative spirit. And therefore, to the extent to which the individual perceives its identification with himself, he places himself under its guidance, and so he becomes one of those who are led by the Spirit. Thus he begins to find the Alpha and the Omega of the divine ideal reproduced in himself. In a very small degree at present, but containing the principle of perpetual growth into an infinite expansion, of which we can as yet form no conception. St. John sums up the whole of this position in his memorable words, "Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." End of chapter.